The silence arrived slowly. It began in the forests of Germany, in the harbors of the Philippines, in the deserts of North Africa. It spread across fields where engines had roared, through cities where convoys had thundered past day and night. By the summer of 1945, the machinery of war simply stopped. Tanks sat where their crews had abandoned them. Trucks lined roads leading nowhere. Aircraft rested on airstrips, their propellers still, their fuel tanks empty. The fighting had ended, but the war had left behind an ocean of steel. Millions of vehicles, tens of millions of tons of metal, jeeps, half-tracks, landing craft, bombers, fighters, transport ships, artillery tractors, amphibious trucks. They had been built in enormous quantities, shipped across oceans, driven through mud and sand and snow, and now they belonged to no one. What do you do with the machines when the war is over? In the first days after surrender, the roads were crowded with soldiers walking away. They left their equipment behind them. Tank columns sat motionless on French highways. Supply trucks were parked in neat rows in British staging areas, keys still in the ignition. In the Pacific, entire fleets of landing craft floated empty in lagoons, engines silent, ramps half open. There was no plan yet, no orders. The war had consumed every hour, every decision, every resource. Peace arrived before anyone was ready for it. The armies that had numbered in the millions began to dissolve. Men wanted to go home. Officers who had commanded divisions found themselves overseeing the mundane task of inventory, counting vehicles, recording serial numbers, trying to understand what they had and where it was. The scale was overwhelming. In Europe alone, the Allied forces had accumulated more than 2 million motor vehicles, tanks by the tens of thousands, aircraft by the hundreds of thousands, ships beyond counting. And almost immediately the question became not how to use them but how to get rid of them. The first instinct was to bring it all home. In the United States, planners imagined vast fleets of cargo ships carrying tanks and trucks back across the Atlantic. Veterans would drive them in parades. Factories would retool them for civilian use. Jeeps would become farm vehicles, bombers would carry mail. It seemed logical. The equipment had been expensive to build. Surely it had value, but the arithmetic was brutal. To ship a single Sherman tank from Europe to the United States cost more than it cost to build a new one. The same was true for most vehicles. Worn engines, damaged transmissions, tires shredded by thousands of miles, saltwater corrosion from ocean crossings, battle damage, hasty repairs, years of deferred maintenance. Much of the equipment was simply used up. And then there was the question of demand. The factories that had built these machines were already pivoting to peacetime production. Cars, refrigerators, tractors. American consumers wanted new things, not military surplus. The War Department realized something uncomfortable. The vehicles were worth more as scrap than as machines. In the summer of 1946, a major in the Quartermaster Corps stood in a depot outside Paris and watched workers drain oil from a line of trucks. The vehicles were less than 3 years old. Many had low mileage, but they were going to be destroyed. Engines would be separated from chassis. Tires would be burned. Metal would be cut into pieces small enough to load onto ships bound for steel mills. It was efficient. It was economical. It felt like waste. This happened thousands of times, in hundreds of locations. In Britain, surplus American vehicles were parked in enormous lots, sometimes covering hundreds of acres. Locals called them graveyards. Workers moved through the rows with cutting torches, dismantling trucks that had carried supplies across Europe. In the Philippines, bulldozers pushed jeeps and trucks off cliffs into the ocean. The salt water would corrode them faster than any salvage crew could process them. It was easier to make them disappear, but not everything was destroyed. Some governments saw opportunity. Britain negotiated to keep tens of thousands of American vehicles rather than return them. France did the same. These machines became the backbone of post-war reconstruction. American trucks hauled rubble in Berlin. Jeeps carried doctors to villages in Italy. Landing craft were converted into fishing boats in Greece. The equipment found second lives, third lives, serving purposes no one had imagined when they were built. In other places, the vehicles simply stayed where the war had left them. In the jungles of New Guinea, aircraft rusted in clearings, vines growing through shattered cockpits. In North Africa, tank hulks became landmarks in the desert, half buried in sand. No one had the resources to remove them. No one had a reason to try. The machinery became part of the landscape. Then there were the more deliberate decisions. Some of the most advanced equipment, particularly aircraft, was kept in storage. Hangars full of fighters and bombers. Engines preserved in oil, waiting for a future conflict that military planners assumed would come. The peace felt temporary. The Cold War was already beginning. Old enemies were becoming new ones. Thousands of B-17 bombers sat in Arizona desert storage, arranged in perfect rows. Most would never fly again, but no one wanted to destroy them. Not yet. By 1948, a pattern had emerged. The most valuable equipment, the newest and most capable machines, were retained or sold to allied nations. The worn-out majority was scrapped. And a third category, the vehicles that fell between useful and worthless, simply lingered. Depots full of trucks no one wanted but no one authorized to destroy. Airfields with hundreds of transport planes, flyable but not needed. The economics were strange. In some cases, it was cheaper to abandon vehicles than to ship them. In others, it was cheaper to sell them for pennies than to guard them. A merchant in Manila bought 300 jeeps for the price of scrap and resold them across Asia. A farmer in France purchased a dozen trucks and used them to rebuild his business. The machinery dispersed, moving through gray markets and surplus auctions, finding its way into the post-war world. But there was something deeper happening. Something that military planners had not anticipated. The war had been industrial, total, consuming entire economies. The machinery had been essential, irreplaceable, and now in peace it was suddenly surplus. The transition revealed something uncomfortable about modern war. It was not just about victory or defeat. It was about production, consumption, and disposal. The vehicles had been built to be used and discarded. A historian examining post-war records would later note that the disposal of military equipment generated almost no public debate. There were no protests, no calls to preserve the machines that had won the war. People wanted to forget the vehicles were reminders of loss, of destruction, of years when normal life had been suspended. Scrapping them was a kind of ritual, a way to close the chapter. In Japan, the process was different. The American occupation forces brought their own vehicles, but they also found thousands of Japanese trucks and tanks, many hidden in warehouses, buried in the ground, camouflaged in forests. These were destroyed more systematically, smelted down, the metal sent to mills to be remade into peaceful things: bicycles, cookware, construction materials. The transformation was intentional. Weapons into tools. By 1955, years after the war ended, most of the vehicles were gone, scrapped, sunk, sold, abandoned. What remained were the exceptions. The tanks preserved in military museums, the aircraft kept in storage, just in case. The jeeps still running on farms in remote regions, their original markings painted over but still visible beneath. And the ghosts, the wrecks in jungles and deserts, slowly consumed by rust and sand and time. Decades later, divers would find landing craft on the ocean floor, still intact, resting where bulldozers had pushed them. Archaeologists would uncover buried aircraft in New Guinea, remarkably preserved in the tropical climate. Collectors would restore jeeps and trucks, painting them in original colors, taking them to shows. The vehicles became historical objects, but they had been tools. Machines built for a specific purpose, in a specific moment. The generation that fought the war rarely spoke about the equipment. They remembered the people, the places, the fear and exhaustion and relief. The vehicles were just there, part of the background. It was later generations who became interested in the machines, who tried to preserve them, who wondered what they had been like to drive, to maintain, to depend on. There is a photograph from 1946. It shows a field in Belgium filled with American trucks, hundreds of them, parked in precise rows. The image is black and white, slightly blurred. The trucks look almost new. In the background, a farmhouse, a few trees. Normal life resuming while the machines wait for a decision that has already been made. Within months, this field would be empty. The trucks would be gone. The grass would grow back. The disposal of millions of military vehicles was not dramatic. It was administrative, bureaucratic, a problem of logistics and economics, solved with spreadsheets and cutting torches. But it marked something. The end of the war was not a single moment. It was a process, a long unwinding, a gradual return to a world that would never quite be the same as the one before. The machinery had been essential, and then it was not. That shift, that sudden irrelevance was part of the aftermath. The soldiers went home. The vehicles were scrapped, and the world moved on, forgetting how much steel and oil and labor had been required, how many machines had been built and used and discarded in the span of a few years. What remains now are fragments, rusted hulks in museums, stories from veterans who remember driving through France in a Jeep whose engine never quite ran right, photographs of airports filled with bombers, all waiting to be cut apart. The vehicles are gone, but they left traces. In the steel of post-war buildings, in the fishing boats converted from landing craft, in the memory of a generation that saw war as something industrial, something built and deployed and eventually, quietly, thrown away. The silence that began in 1945 is complete now. The engines will never start again. The convoys will never reform. The machines served their purpose and vanished, leaving behind only the question of what it means to build so much, use it so briefly, and then let it disappear.